Good afternoon. Welcome, everyone, to the Robert F. Kennedy Book Club. I'm Lynn Delaney, Executive Director. First of all, I'd like to thank Nisa Patel and Belina Pristina for organizing another great gathering of our book club. And thank you to our Leadership Council, our Board of Directors, our staff, and our friends who have joined us today. Our program will be about an hour long, and it will include 10 minutes for Q&A. You can put your questions into the box, and our moderator will read the questions for Clara to answer. We're really excited about today's discussion featuring our friend Clara Bingham talking to us about her bestseller, The Movement, How Women's Liberation Transformed America. This could not be more timely or important right now as we watch these hard-fought, hard-won rights eroding right before our eyes. I'm delighted also that Margaret Engel is with us today to moderate our discussion, and she'll be introducing Clara in a few minutes. Margaret is the director of the Alicia Patterson Foundation, which is the oldest journalism fellowship program in the country. She serves on the advisory board of the Fund for Investigative Journalism. She's an author, a journalist, a speechwriter, a former Washington Post reporter, and she was managing editor of the museum. She's also a playwright. And in keeping with our theme of strong and courageous women today, I'd like to note that she wrote Red Hot Patriot, which was about political commentator Molly Ivins and starred Kathleen Turner. But I think my very favorite thing about Peggy is that she volunteers her time, lots and lots and lots of time, to chairing our Robert F. Kennedy Journalism Awards Committee. So please welcome two good friends of Robert F. Kennedy Human Rights, Peggy Engel and Clara Bingham. Peggy, over to you.
Thank you so much, Lynn. I'm so thrilled that this week we're really looking at such an intriguing and comprehensive book, and it's no surprise that it comes from journalist and author Clara Bingham, because she's spent most of her professional life writing about social justice and women's issues. After graduating from Harvard, where she was on the varsity alpine ski team and a news editor of the Harvard Independent, she was press secretary on the Michael Dukakis presidential campaign, and then became a correspondent in Washington for Newsweek, covering the George H.W. Bush White House. And after the 1992 Year of the Woman elections, she wrote her first book, Women on the Hill, Challenging the Culture of Congress, which chronicled the lives of 4 female members of the 103rd Congress. Her second book, Class Action, the landmark case that changed sexual harassment law. She co-wrote that with Laura Leedy Gansler, and it tells the story of female taconite miners in northern Minnesota who became the first women ever to sue a company as a class for sexual harassment. The book, you may know, was adapted into the 2005 feature film North Country, starring Charlize Theron and Frances McDormand. And both of those actresses received Oscar nominations for their roles in that really gripping film. A few years later, Bingham produced a documentary that exposed the ravages of mountaintop removal coal mining in Appalachia. And if you've ever seen the pictures of what that looks like, you will be horrified. The award-winning film, The Last Mountain, premiered at Sundance Film Festival and was screened in theaters in more than 60 cities. Her third book, Witness to the Revolution, Radicals, Resistors, Vets, Hippies, and the Year America Lost Its Mind and Found Its Soul, was published in 2016 and used an oral history narrative style, the same one that she has employed in this latest book, very much like Studs Terkel did in Working. The Movement, How Women's Liberation Transformed America, 1963 to 1973, was published this July to uniformly enthusiastic reviews. The New York Times called it historically astute, rollicking good fun, and a deftly arranged collection of remembrances, anecdotes, explications, and arguments. We're pleased to have Clara Bingham, who lives in Brooklyn, with us today. Clara.
Thank you so much, Peggy, for that fulsome biography and generous. I'm very happy to be here and so excited to speak to the RFK community, RFK Human Rights Foundation community, and honored that you would have me. And I'm excited to talk about my book, which is, of course, now a more relevant piece of history than I ever could have imagined when I started working on it 5 years ago.
That's wonderful. Well, I'm going to talk about some of the key themes and have you speak to them. But first, there was one phrase in your book that you wrote that I really, if I could needlepoint, I would put on a pillow. And it is, misogyny never dies. It just occasionally goes into hiding. That's such a wonderful message for us today. So when you think about that, what does that portend for men and women who are looking at the current political situation?
A lot of things. I mean, and also, I think it's important to understand of course, the history that came before this election, and there was so much to it. And of course, only 50 years ago, in the mid 70s, early mid 70s, do women even begin to start gaining rights in the public sphere, so that we really haven't been gone that far. You know, we're just getting started, women are. But that misogyny, this sort of understanding that women are lesser than, that they're not as qualified to be in the public realm, that they're not as smart, they're not as physically capable, they're not as emotionally capable as men, is something that's as age old as, you know, the Bible and before. And so I think it's always going to be the wave that women are going to need to push up against. And I don't think it's really going anywhere for a while. And it's just because it's there, and because we need to understand that it's almost a sort of primal part of people. And there are plenty of female misogynists out there too, by the way. This is not just a male-female thing. It's just an understanding of the difference between the genders that has just lasted for so long and is very ingrained in Christian nationalism, in fascism, in a lot of political systems, actually, that are conservative. And it's so in a way, it's at the heart of what people who want equality between the sexes, it's at the heart of what they need to fight against. And it's just an important thing to understand is there.
One of the thrilling things about your book, and what makes it for me such a page turner, is that it's not just the usual suspects, that you really took the time to find people who were actually working on the ground, people like Margot Jefferson and Patsy Mink and Lynn Povich, names who are central to the work that was done, but oftentimes we're not really taking a deep dive into how all these pieces of legislation emerged and how people changed attitudes. So tell me a bit about how you chose the hundreds, it's over 100 people who you interviewed, and why it was important to select not the big names that everyone might be familiar with.
Thank you for appreciating that, because I have to say, when I was working on the book and would mention it to anybody, the first and almost only question was, have you interviewed Gloria Steinem? Because it was as if she was the only feminist ever, and she would be the first person to counter that argument. And she's always been very inclusive, and upset that the media and people just think she's the only feminist out there. In a way, it's sort of lazy of the media. And so I really wanted, this was a mainstream mass movement that took place. And it meant that millions and millions and millions of people were involved in it. And so I really wanted to show how this was more than just a few women with ideas. This was actually a tidal wave, and it was almost a change of consciousness. And that change of consciousness was, women actually are capable of doing more than just being mothers and housewives and caretakers. And And that had never really been the case in terms of the law, in terms of people's behavior until the late 60s and 70s. So I interviewed people who were from all walks of life, artists, and not just politicians like Bella. I didn't interview people who were dead, of course, but I did a lot of archival work to find their voices. People like Bella Abzug, for example, and Shirley Chisholm were no longer alive, and they were, some of the great politicians of that time for women. And Martha Griffiths, who was a member of Congress, who was very central, but also artists and also athletes and people in the health movement, the women who founded Our Bodies Ourselves. And I went through the chronology of this crucial 10-year period and located the most important events and moments, and then looked for who the women were. They were mostly women who were involved in those moments in history. And then I tracked them down.
One of the most encouraging aspects of your book that I think readers will really cling to in these perilous times is the good work that was done in church basements, in committee rooms, marches, going to the State House. Are we in store for another 10-year period like that?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I see this book in a way, it's a blueprint for change. And past is prologue. We need to know our history, and now it's more important than ever. And one of these women who I call second wave warriors, the first wave of feminism being suffrage, many of them came out of the civil rights movement and the anti-Vietnam War movement, the peace movement. And so by the time the late 60s rolled around and they were engaging in what they saw as a really new liberation movement for them, the women's liberation movement, they were organizers, and they were very skilled at getting press, at getting crowds, at pushing politicians, at filing lawsuits that were needed. And so they had so much organizational skill and sort of political skill that it really helped them get so much done in such a short period of time. And I feel like those organizational skills are going to be more important than ever for people who are looking for progress and equality and freedom for women especially.
Well, the sheer volume of work is daunting. Are we too exhausted? Have we already worked hard enough that this perhaps won't happen again?
Well, I think it's going to be, I think everyone needs to take a break right now, and there isn't too much to be done immediately, but soon enough, people who care, and people who care about people who don't have what they have. I mean, we have to worry about the women in Texas and Alabama and Georgia who will be dying in the next few years if we don't take measures to help them with reproductive rights, and so many other, of course, areas and populations might be compromised and will need help. So people are going to need to retool and come back. And I know there's a women's march scheduled for January 18th, 2 days before the inauguration. And that might be just about when everyone's ready to hit the streets again. But it is really hard. I mean, so many people work so hard on this election, and we have to keep on working.
Your book has so many jewels of information that people might not remember or never knew, but you described how in 1973, the FBI officially closed its files on the women's liberation movement. And that was really an action that showed how mainstream the tenets had become. But yet there's now a backlash, most notably the overturning of Roe v. Wade in 2022, and states beginning to criminalize abortion. So will the fight for women's liberation be as protracted and filled with setbacks as the 73-year fight to secure the right to vote?
Oh, no. I can actually say I don't think that will happen because women have so much more power now. than the suffragettes. I mean, they really hadn't, I mean, back when we were fighting for suffrage, which took so long, they were nowhere. There were no women in political office at all. There were no women who could practically own property at that stage. So, and the changes that were made in the early 70s and late 60s, the Title IX, Title VII, the passage of the ERA, which of course we know wasn't ratified, but there were many advances. The Credit Act that was passed in 1974, so women could finally get credit and credit cards. Women now, and of course, opening up schools and education and sports and the workplace, which did not happen until after the Civil Rights Act was passed in 1964. And in that bill, the one word sex was added to Title VII, which was the part of the Civil Rights Act for employment discrimination, to bar employment discrimination. So that it wasn't until the, really 65 and the late 60s that women who were being discriminated against at work, which was almost universal, could finally have legal recourse. So we are now in such a better place, women in general, than they were 50 years ago, and certainly than they were when they were trying to get, the vote. That, we have 150 plus women in Congress. And when Shirley Chisholm got to Congress in 1969, she was the only Black woman in the entire House and Senate. We now have 2 Black women senators who are new. There's just much more political power. There's more power on Wall Street, not enough. Women are no longer powerless in the public sphere. So therefore, let's hope that they will be able to make changes that are needed more quickly.
You talked about Shirley Chisholm being so solitary and alone, really, when she came to Congress. There's a new documentary that's going to be coming out just about the lack of bathrooms for women representatives and senators. And it's slightly comedic, but it's called Pissed Off by documentarian Aviva Kempner. And she interviewed a lot of the women and just how impossible it was to even get space in the Capitol for a bathroom for women.
I think a lot of that might have taken place when I wrote my first book, which was the 103rd Congress, the first one after Anita Hill, which was the Year of the Woman in 92. And they had no bathrooms on the floor of the Senate, anywhere near the floor of the Senate for women. And I think very few in the House. And that was one of the things that they had to address.
You wrote in the book that, quote, it was a bedroom and boardroom and assembly line revolution, a restructuring of how men and women in America saw each other, a reinvention of roles, and a fundamental identity shift. How do you think the identity shift part of it is faring now, and what will it bring in the coming years?
Well, I think the identity is shifted, and it's set for with evangelical, Christian nationalists who feel strongly that women should not participate very much in public life and should be, just as domestic and have children and have that be their main goal in life and purpose in life. Except for that group of America, which is significant. The consciousness has changed. Women are judges, women are vice presidents, women are governors. There are 13 women governors. That would have been unheard of in the 70s. So women are in executive, they're in legislative, they're in business positions of power. That was something that was absolutely almost ridiculed in the late 60s and early 70s when women wanted to achieve that. I mean, just little examples, like women couldn't run the Boston Marathon until 1974, and I interviewed the first woman to run the Boston Marathon in 1966 illegally, and then it took another 8 years for it to be okay because, of course, the fear was their uteruses would fall out, if they run. So that was the idea that women just are, Ruth Bader Ginsburg graduates from Harvard Law School and is rejected from 41 law firms who don't want to hire women, so those days are over. They really are. And so at least that isn't what we're up against.
Well,
We're,
however, in so many of the man in the street interviews during this last election, I was hearing these old tropes from 1930, 1940 about women don't have the capacity to have the energy to stand up to world leaders. The fact that 36 other countries have had women at the top really seems to be lost on so much of the American public. Why do we have this sort of retrograde view about women not being able to be president in this country?
I don't know. I mean, I think a lot of it comes from our sort of Christian puritanical kind of foundation of our country versus a lot of other Western European countries that just aren't as culturally conservative in a way as we are. And also I think in terms of this election in particular, the manosphere, as it is now called, the social media environment, that younger men especially are engulfed by, and there's a lot of misogyny out there that has found a new platform, and because there is such a sort of spread of information and people get it from so many different places, it's so easy to propagandize on this topic. And it's a very deep issue. And I really, we don't know yet how much of Kamala Harris's loss was due to her being a woman and being Black, how much of it was, misogyny and racism, but there certainly had to be a portion of that. There were so many other reasons why people said they wouldn't vote for her. But, even in the states like Arizona and Nevada, where people split their vote, a lot of women split their vote and voted for abortion rights in the referendum and then for Donald Trump, that I thought was suspect. It made me think that for some reason they didn't trust Kamala Harris to be the leader that they thought America needed, and that there was an anti-feminist and sort of anti-woman idea behind that vote.
You used a very interesting organizational technique for this book that I think is the most painless way to learn history. You used interviews and news clippings instead of a long exposition or analytical text. And the Washington Monthly described it this way: Bingham places her subjects in conversation with each other, documentary style. The effect is utterly engrossing. I really agree, but tell me why you chose and think that this is an effective technique in explaining social movements in particular.
Well, I've always been enamored with oral history, and I've always been enamored with documentary, and they're both very similar. And that, I consider one of the perfect books, Edie, which is the biography of Edie Sedgwick, written by George Plimpton and Jean Stein. It's one of those seamless oral history biographies where you don't even notice that there's no narrator, and you go from one voice to another describing her life. And so I've always admired the power of Studs Terkel's work because it's the power of first person voice. There's an immediacy to it. There's an emotional immediacy. And when I made The Last Mountain, when I produced that documentary, I interviewed grassroots environmental activists all over Appalachia who were such incredible characters. They were so courageous and colorful and interesting. And after that documentary, I decided to go back to writing books, but I really wanted to write an oral history. And so I wrote The Witness to the Revolution. And that was my first oral history. And it really, it made me never want to go back, because I think especially when writing about movements, when it's a large group of people, it's also the most authentic way, I think, to write a history, because and when it comes to the women's movement, the personal was political. That was one of their great slogans. And therefore, understanding how that changed affected people personally, I thought was so important. So in order to really understand what it felt like to be there, what it felt like to be on the ground, and to have your life transformed, I didn't want to have to tell my readers that. I wanted them to hear it from the horse's mouth, to hear it from Nancy Stearns, who was fighting for abortion rights, who was an amazing lawyer in New York City, or Flo Kennedy, or, Marilyn Webb. I mean, all these incredible characters, each of whom had moments in their lives, and met several of them that were life changing, and that also changed the culture for the rest of us. And so there's a power to the oral history. And I think if it can be woven together in a narrative, it can just be more accessible. I like how you call it painless. It definitely, I found that younger people are able to relate to this history, the way it's written, in a way that a straight history, as I call it, is a little harder. So I really like this form.
Well, the form, but also your attitude towards it allowed you to be so very inclusive, because you were bringing in the civil rights movement truly as a direct point of inflection, which kickstarted this second wave of feminism. And that's often neglected in feminist literature. They tend to choose a lane, but this, I felt, was so inclusive. And can you tell us a little bit more about some of the connections that you made between the civil rights movement and the feminist movement, and why it was important to make that connection?
Yeah, it was one of the most exciting parts of my research, and I felt as if many of the legal and moral architects of the second wave feminist movement were civil rights activists, and usually Black women, and that they because they understood discrimination earlier than white women did, and because of their own personal experience. And one of the early, I think, really godmothers of this movement was a woman named Pauli Murray, who it was a Black woman from North Carolina originally, and she wanted to be a civil rights lawyer, went to Howard University Law School, where she was one of only 2 women, and it was in the 40s, in the 1940s, and when she got there, it was her first time of being in a race-neutral environment, because it was, of course, all Black. And she faced extreme sex discrimination from her fellow students and her professors. She, of course, ended up graduating #1 in her class because she was, I think, a genius, an amazing legal strategist in mind. But that was her aha moment, because she hadn't occurred to her that sex discrimination could be as powerful or as important as race discrimination. Mm-hmm. And that's when she understood you have to bring both women and Black people up together. And if you can't do that simultaneously in parallel, then no one's going to get ahead. And so she helped Betty Friedan start the National Organization for Women in 1966. And she also wrote a very important legal article called Jane Crow and the Law, in which and this was in 1965, so it was very early, where she laid out all of the statutes that were on the books all over the country that discriminated against women. I mean, back in 1965, just for example, if you lived in Michigan or California, women could not be bartenders unless their husbands or their fathers happened to own the bar. Women couldn't lift more than 30 pounds on most factory floors. Therefore, they never could get promoted. There were so many laws that in many states, women were not required to sit on juries. In some states, they weren't allowed to. So they really weren't getting equal representation before the law. And so she helped. Then RBG took that important article when she started her case at the ACLU, at the Women's Project there in the early 70s, and started taking her cases to the Supreme Court to try to break down these laws. But so Pauli Murray, because she understood civil rights early on and race discrimination, was able to be one of the leaders of the women's movement. Another example is Eleanor Holmes Norton, who is now, of course, a member of Congress representing DC. But she was also a Yale Law School student and had gone to Mississippi in 1964. And she helped Fannie Lou Hamer get out of jail when Fannie Lou Hamer had been badly beaten. So she was really in the trenches of the civil rights movement. And then she went to work at the ACLU in New York when a group of Newsweek women, Lim Povich being one of them, came to her and said, "We think we're being discriminated against." These women were all white, and they showed the masthead of Newsweek to Eleanor, and she noticed that all the top jobs were men and all the bottom jobs were women. And to her, that was a clean cut civil rights case. Those are just the kind of cases she had been prosecuting for Black, men and women. And so she explained to those white Newsweek women, this is what is happening to you. You are being discriminated against in the exact same way that Black people have been discriminated against in the workplace. And so she took on their case, and it was the first one ever for its first class action for sex discrimination.
Right. Well, some of the most heartrending descriptions in your book are women who were talking about the very dehumanizing and unsafe abortions that they had before Roe v. Wade. And can you tell us what caused the frequency of these sort of back alley abortions and how state interferences created such conditions for women? It was truly unsafe. And again, why Roe v. Wade was so important to women's liberation.
Yeah, by the late 60s, mid to late 60s, there was a healthcare crisis because it was a perfect storm of the sexual revolution. For the first time in sort of large numbers, people were having sex before marriage, and a scarcity of birth control access. Birth control was not prescription birth control was not available nationally for married couples, married women, until 1965. So before that, it was state by state. And so there were different state laws for birth control, and it was very hard to access. Women who were not married would put on fake wedding rings and try to convince a doctor to give them a diaphragm or the birth control pill. And then it wasn't even legal nationally for single women until 1972. And so those two Supreme Court cases were so important. Before that, you had no birth control, and you had, women having sex, on levels that had not happened before because the culture had completely changed, and doctors were in crisis. Over 1 million women in America took their lives into their own hands to have illegal abortions before Roe v. Wade. At least 1,000 women a year died. So, and then hundreds and thousands and thousands were injured, became infertile. And there were wards in city hospitals like Cook County and Harlem that were designated for women who were suffering from botched abortions. And we know the stats that at Cook County, 100 women a week were coming in and out of these wards. So it was absolutely terrifying. And it's why there were many different cases coming up to the Supreme Court for abortion rights. And Roe v. Wade just happened to be the one that got there first, and that is what the law was based on. And there's much argument about whether that was a good idea or not. But it certainly saved thousands and thousands of American women's lives.
Well, I remember as a freshman in college, this is just months before Roe v. Wade came down, that we would have to go the halls knocking on doors, raising money for girls to get a plane ticket to go to New York to get an abortion. And this was routine. So whether we go back to those days, I think some of the states have some very interesting situations to grapple with as far as of the electorate and what the situation is on the ground. What were some of the light bulb moments when you were doing all these interviews where you clearly saw these points of inflection unfolding in history? And conversely, well, and really in conjunction with that, what it was like to collect these gems of historic information from these actors in a really critical part of our historic timeline.
Well, one of them, I have to say, especially now because of abortion rights being under so much threat, was interviewing the women who were members of the Jane Collective, who had developed a very intricate abortion underground, where women were coming from all over the Midwest to Chicago to get safe, illegal abortions. And it started with a woman named Heather Booth, who is an amazing now amazing Democratic organizer, and who was a member of also had worked in the civil rights movement, and she was a student at the University of Chicago. And a friend of hers called her pleading for help because his girlfriend needed an abortion. And she found a civil rights doctor who would agree to give this woman a safe abortion. And the word got out just like lightning. And she started getting phone calls in her dorm in Chicago. And one of the women who called her, this was what was an exciting reporting moment for me, because I interviewed Marjorie Tabankin, who was, you may know who she is. Was an
Yes.
important political activist, and she was a student at the University of Wisconsin. And she told me about, I called this phone number because a girl at the University of Wisconsin desperately needed an abortion, and I'd heard about this woman called Jane in Chicago. And meanwhile, later on, years later, she and Heather Booth became very friendly. But at the time, she had no idea who Heather was. She called that random number she'd gotten and got Heather Booth on the other line. And they raised money to send this woman up from Madison, Wisconsin to Chicago, where Heather found a doctor for her. But then this evolved because the numbers were just too big and Heather couldn't handle it on her own. And Chicago had a very strong women's liberation community. And so she brought this to her group and Chicago Women's Liberation. And about 20 to 30 women signed up to help. And they organized an elaborate network. And it was all extremely secretive and underground. Eventually, they learned how to do the abortions themselves. They discovered the doctor who they had been trusting didn't have an MD. He had probably been trained by the mafia. Abortion had become part of the mafia sort of line of work. And therefore, they thought, well, if he's not a doctor, then why don't we learn from him? And they became apprentices, essentially. And by the time they were busted in 1972, they had performed 11,000 abortions. This, and all safe, everyone had survived. And this just gives you a sense of the volume of need. And it's why just making abortion illegal is never going to stop women from getting them, and they're just going to do what they need to do, no matter what.
This is such a hidden history of the extent of it, what you've just described, that I think is so valuable about your book, because we knew the general outlines, but when you get the people who were really involved on the ground talking about it, you find out all these truly terrifying and incredible details of how it actually spun out. And I know that there's a similar group of the Janes today that's working on making sure that there's access to abortion pills and getting women into safe situations for their reproductive health care. So there are many parallels from this 10-year ban that you wrote about in today. And so what are the biggest points do you think that we should be keeping in mind for the upcoming years for women's liberation?
Well, I really think that focusing on reproductive rights and understanding that it is the absolute most critical thing for women to be able to control their bodies, control their lives, not have the state, not have the state legislature, which is in a lot of the ban states, majority white male, not have allow those men to control their bodies. And that as much as women can help the women in those states, and there are so many organizations now who are doing that, they are going to be needed more than ever. So I think understanding that, and then also that when that's at the most sort of basic personal liberty issue, that back then women always said, and it's still, this phrase is used all the time, reproductive rights are human rights. This is not a political issue. This is a human rights issue. And that's why I'm so maddened. I'm so crazed when people say, well, Trump won't sign an abortion ban. Well, he might not sign a national abortion ban, but already there's so many ways of chipping away at women's rights in ban states, especially. I call those ban states Jane Crow states, because women do not have equal rights in those states. They are living in a form of physical slavery, essentially. And of course, we know this isn't just for women who need abortions. This is for women who are having miscarriages, who are having ectopic pregnancies, who even need pap smears. I mean, women aren't going to be able to get the kind of gynecological care they want because doctors don't want to practice in Idaho, where they're afraid of going to jail, and Texas. So we know that this is a very basic, serious, so keeping the heat up on how important abortion rights and reproductive rights are is really important. And then I think gaining political power. And that's such an important thing that women like Bella Abzug understood, and Martha Griffiths, that you need to get on the inside and you need to get elected. And women who are getting elected to state houses, in particular local elections, are now so important because states are controlling so much. And so I think putting as much energy behind electing women who are pro-choice and supporting women who live in ban states has got to be the most important agenda for women.
Terrific points. We're going to turn to some of the questions that have come in. Here's a question. Are there any activists that have made a strong impact on you from the 1960s and 70s?
Oh, yes.
So many.
It's almost like if that's a Sophie's Choice thing, it's up there with who was your favorite interview, because
Yeah.
I just love everybody. Well, I mentioned Polly Murray, who is absolutely, I think, one of the most important, and also Eleanor Holmes Norton, also Heather Booth. I'm a huge Shirley Chisholm fan, and I think this is a good time to tell her story a little bit, because she also was, her unbought, unbossed was one of her great campaign slogans. And it's so true today. Think of Trump saying unbought, unbossed. He's bought by everybody, essentially. But she was so incredibly brave, Shirley Chisholm. She ran for Congress in a newly created Black majority district in Brooklyn and Bed-Stuy in 1968 against all odds, and the male establishment was very upset that she ran and that she won, because they thought a Black man should really have that job. She gets to Congress and faces the most horrific. It was almost some of the hardest chapters for me to write was her first year in Congress, because this mostly Southern white congressmen were so insulting to her in the most sort of peevish, awful, insulting ways. And she faced them down with humor and did not let it, get to her. And she then ran for president in 1972, which was also incredibly controversial. And she did that because she realized that young people were so disenfranchised from the system at that point, because the anti-war movement had just, been trying for so hard. They were so alienated by the system. and weren't really participating in politics at that stage. And Nixon had just changed the voting age from 21 to 18, and she just decided that she needed to run so she could give voice to young people, Black people, the LGBTQ community that at that point had really no agency, and women. And she was the kind of original Rainbow Coalition politician. And even though she only received 2.7% of the vote, knew that she couldn't win, she inspired so many people. And I interviewed Barbara Lee, who at the time in 72 was a student at Mills College, and she was on welfare. She was a mother of two, and she was not registered to vote. She was head of the Black Student Union and a radical, and didn't feel represented by the mostly white men who were in politics until she met Shirley Chisholm, who told her she had to register to vote and she had to run her campaign in Oakland, which Barbara Lee did. And then later, of course, became the congresswoman from Oakland, representing that district for 13 years. So Shirley Chisholm was inspired so many people to get engaged in the system and try to change it from within. And I thought that was incredibly noble and inspirational.
Second question. You write about the iconic Betty Friedan and her issues with lesbians in the movement, as well as her tone deafness around race and civil rights issues. That was new to me. Could you talk more about her and perhaps about how the women's movement has enlarged to become more racially inclusive and more inclusive of lesbian, queer, and transgender women?
Yes, very good question. I mean, Betty Friedan's book, The Feminine Mystique, came out in 1963. So that was originated as her poll that she took with her Smith classmates on their 15th reunion. And she took that poll in the late 50s when all of those white educated women who'd gone to Smith had moved to the suburbs and were having children and were not working. And they almost universally, Betty discovered, were very depressed and felt disempowered and unhappy. And she called it the problem that had no name. But it was a very white it was a book about her cohort of colleagues and classmates who are all white, middle class, upper middle class, college educated women. In order for them to go to work, of course, they would need someone to take care of their house and take care of their children. Betty Friedan didn't bring that into the conversation. Those women would undoubtedly be Black domestic or, women who were from poorer parts of the country who could take care of those white women's children. The book comes out in 1963 at the height of the civil rights movement in the South. And so even though it was a massive runaway bestseller, and it certainly touched a chord with so many women who were in that situation, millions of them, and did do a lot to begin the second wave feminist movement, it left out a huge part of of women. And so now that we look back at that book, she has lost some credibility because she was so oblivious in a way of what would be needed for white women to go to work, and who on whose backs they would need to rely. So and then it also, she was terrible with the lesbian women who were in members of NOW, who she did not want NOW to be associated with gay rights because she was worried about the politics of it, and it was a legitimate concern. The white male mainstream press had ridiculed many feminists and for being lesbians, and it was an easy way to dismiss the movement and not take it seriously. Also, Betty wanted to attract suburban women. She wanted to be a big movement, and she was worried that those women would not want to associate with lesbians. And so she tried to squash as much sort of lesbian activity and acceptance of other inside of Now, and she ended up losing. I mean, she lost, but she did a lot of terrible things. She staged a coup in the New York Now office, and it was very hard at the beginning for lesbians who were involved in Now. They later were able to win the day, but it was a fight. They had to fight with Betty. So, and ultimately, Black women ended up starting their own organization because they didn't feel included at Now. And they started the National Black Feminist Organization, which I end the book with. It's their first big conference was in 1973. And so it was sort of later in the 70s that Black women found their own voice in their own group to join each other with and pave their own way, which unfortunately they really felt that they needed to do.
Let me sneak in one last question from the chat before you do your concluding remarks. And this question asked, you included some great interviews with Ruth Bader Ginsburg. What struck you about her role and work in that era, especially in light of what she went on to do many years later?
Well, I just I didn't get to interview her in person, unfortunately, and she was but I did find amazing interviews that other people did with her and her memoirs. And she was absolutely heroic. I mean, she really was, because she had a very particular approach, which was to make change step by step. And she felt strongly that she needed to educate judges who did not understand what sexism was really and what the power of it was and why it was wrong. And so she found case after case where there were statutes that discriminated against women. And often, if there were times when it actually would discriminate against men, she would use that as an example of how we have to have a gender neutral, we have to have gender neutral laws when it comes to Social Security and it comes to military benefits. And so she really, she was amazing because she stuck to it for a long time. And then, of course, was able to make her mark on the Supreme Court.
All right. Give us a little bit of concluding remarks, and then I'll say a few words and Lynn will.
Well, I think we have so much to learn from these women, and especially now that we're so discouraged. And it's almost comforting, I find, to go back to this book and to remember how hard it was for them, how much they did, and how far we have actually come. And we have just lost this election, and we have just lost Roe v. Wade, and so those are two huge setbacks. But they aren't the kind of setbacks that we haven't had before. And so before we throw up our hands and give up, I think it's really important to look at the women who we owe where we are now to, and honor their legacy by continuing to fight the fight.
Thank you, Clara. This book I found to be such a balm for the soul, as also a guidepost of what can be accomplished and what can be accomplished in the future. So I think anyone who reads it is going to be activated and interested and see what women had to face, and in much more perilous times. We are further ahead, and this book is just such a rich compendium of progress and courage. It's quite fascinating, and I hope everyone does pick it up and read it. Lynn, I think you're muted.
You're muted. Thank you, Peggy.
Okay.
There we go. Thank you so much, Peggy. And Clara, thank you for today, and thank you for the book. As mentioned earlier, I think it's a roadmap that we're going to need for many years to come. On January 28th, our book club will feature Nick Kristof in Chasing Hope. So if all of you who've joined this book club would like to participate in that. It's just go to our website, www.rfkhumanrights.org. You can join the club, support our work, and don't forget to follow us on social media to keep up with the ever-changing human rights landscape. And remember to stand with us and to speak truth to power. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me.
Terrific book.